Thank you to the Mahoney and Raftery Wealth Management team of Raymond James, as well as these season sponsors and donors like you who make Colorado MahlerFest possible. Please consider supporting the festival during this year-end giving season. Thank you.
For this tension between the private and the public Mahler is an interesting one. As a composer, he's very much a solitary and a singular figure. But as a performer and as a working figure in his own day, he was very much a collaborative figure. And he lived and worked in a nexus of other talented people who were all consciously participating in a sort of historical moment. And maybe the epicenter of that was the Beethoven exhibition in Vienna. Can you talk a little bit about that historical moment, who was involved, and how it came to be Beethoven and Mahler's role in that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back, I think, to as you get to the end of the 1890s, the sort of frenetic climate, the sort of grew ever more intense in Vienna. There's a famous painter who everyone will know, Gustav Klimt, who was asked to paint the ceilings of the University of Vienna, and he depicted images which were not acceptable to the academic community. This is law and medicine and justice, and he depicted them in ways that rather showed the dark side of these things. You know, they were not represented in idealized ways. They were not represented according to academic standards, and the learned professors of the university didn't much care for it. But it became an enormous row within the government, within universities, and within all the artists of the time. And it was a battle that Klimt lost. I mean, the paintings were never appended to the ceilings of the university. This created, I think, a climate in which artists began to feel rather beleaguered, and that if they were being made to conform to the norms of academia or in the service of the state in ways that they didn't much care for. So out of that grew the secession movement, which were mainly visual artists. There were sculptors and craftspeople as well, but they wanted to campaign in a way for the freedom of the artist to tell the truth as it is, to be liberated from convention and academic norm, and from the interference of the state. And Klimt became, I suppose, the focus of that. And in 1902, the Secession held an exhibition in their famous Cabbage House building in Vienna, which was an exhibition devoted to Beethoven. And rather provocatively, they commissioned a statue from Max Klinger, which presented Beethoven sitting in a throne as if to oppose the official imperial throne. And Klimt also created a frieze in which Mahler was depicted as a knight in shining armor, standing up for the ideals of great art and human aspiration, and these threatened by the dark forces of nature and human weakness, which were depicted in terrifying forms as well. And Mahler, on that occasion, for the opening of that, he arranged, of course, a section of the finale of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, as if, again, to make this statement about, again, rather Nietzschean in tone, that the Dionysian forces of nature were ultimately going to sweep away all that stood before them. You know, this kind of almost like a populist uprising. well, the exhibition obviously was, I mean, I think by then the academic establishment were fairly reconciled to this. I think they didn't mind artists doing their own thing as long as it didn't end up on the ceilings in their buildings. But this idea of the free artist, and of course Beethoven is the epitome of that, and therefore even 100 years after Beethoven, they're still seeing Beethoven's example as the way forward. And at that time, still, I think a sense of social progress would come from the visions that artists had. I think that was obviously coming into question as the First World War approached, but they still had this notion that artists stood up for ideals, and that if artists did that, it would transform society, it would create the utopian world that they envisioned. And I think that that had become more a Nietzschean vision, in the sense that they realized it could only happen if this Dionysian freedom was invigorated the social realm, while in fact I think the accounts suggest that life under the Habsburgs, really going back many years, was often quite oppressive and controlling and disapproving of this kind of liberal progressive outlook. So I mean, it's a complex relationship I think the Habsburgs have with their professional artists. I mean, sometimes embracing them, sometimes silencing them, depending which way the wind was blowing. But certainly around that time, which we're talking about, the time Mahler was writing the 5th and 6th Symphony, you know, this Beethoven was the pop star of the day. I mean, that was still the case amongst practicing artists in all genres. You know, you had to define yourself in relation to this figure because he was his own kind of emperor, sitting in his own kind of throne.
Haydn, you know, when he invented sonata form, he didn't invent the phrase sonata form. He started writing works that were of a certain structure, and at some later point, an academic said, "Oh, what Haydn's doing here is this, 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 and this, and this." And it seems like there's always cycles where there'll be a creative breakthrough of some kind, and then the academy, such as it is, will sort of dissect that and explain how it's done and codify the rules of functional harmony or chromatic harmony or sonata form or whatever. And in doing so, kind of kill that moment. And so in Beethoven, you have this, you know, maybe the biggest leap forward from a single composer ever. And one of the things he contributes to is this sense that it's the artist who really says what's what and what's true and what's good. You know, Beethoven's adage of what is difficult must be good is a new approach to the world. And I think from that you get Wagner. And it seems that the secessionists and Mahler were all sort of saying much the same thing, which is, you know, this debate doesn't belong to the academy. It belongs to the community of artists. And, you know, you can even see that in the humorous song in praise of lofty intellect that Mahler is saying essentially, you know, it's not for the opinion makers, the critics, the academics to say what art is or what music is. It's for us to define, and it's for us to change the world through our work.
In einem tiefen Tal, Kuckuck und Nachtigall täten ein Bett anschlagen, zu singen um das Meisterstück. Gewinn es Kunst, gewinn es Glück, Dank soll nach und fragen. flogen vor den Richter bald, wie die Sache ward erzählt, schuf sie sollten singen. Die Nachtigall sang lieblich aus. Der Esel sprach, du machst mir's graus, du machst mir's graus. Edna, ich kann's im Kopf nicht bringen. Der Kuckuck drauf fing an, geschwind sein Sand durch Herz und Mark und Wind. Der Esel Peter sprach nur wart, ein Urteil will ich sprechen, ja sprechen. Wohl sungen hast du Nachtigall, aber Kuckuck singst du voran, und hältst den Takt beim Innen. Drum sprech ich nach meinem Hohnverstand, und kostet gleich ein ganzes Land, so lass ich dich gewinnen. Kuckuck, ja.
Yes, and I think you see that summed up beautifully in the Meistersinger of Wagner. The whole story is about that. How do you, if you have a set of codified rules and standards, how do you absorb and embrace the new, which is in a sense nature, the ever evolving process of nature coming into human society, and the artist is often on the cusp of that. He is the, if you like, the Parsifal figure, the heroic knight who's standing on the edge of the new, and that's where I suppose again, Beethoven is that kind of archetype for these artists to follow. But of course, and Nietzsche again also summing up that perspective, which is that the Dionysian is always bringing about change. It's always undermining the norm, the convention. And if we get stuck in convention, we become half asleep. We lose our creative zip, and society ceases to thrive. I mean, I think this is really what they're trying to say is that if we get stuck in a rut, society becomes decadent. It begins to decline. Moral standards decline. It loses its energy. And you get this sort of post-imperial malaise which sets in, where societies are struggling to reinvent themselves. I mean, we see that today in various countries, in the USA, for instance, very much that struggle to try and find a way of renewing society, and new ideas that perhaps can't come through because the logjam of the political system doesn't let them come through. It's a sort of recurrent theme in history. I'm sure the Roman Empire the same. There's just a point where things get a bit stuck, and that's when artists pop up and they start coming up with new ideas, new ways of thinking, new forms, visionary possibilities, and they speak directly from nature rather than through the medium of convention. And that's when the struggle begins between the individual and the art and the society in which they live. I always think with Mahler, though, that he had it all in a way, because he was both doing the voicing nature in a very direct and original way, but at the same time he conquered the musical world. I mean, that's really making him into the kind of Übermensch of his day, and I suspect he was revered somewhat in the same way as Beethoven, and that's evidenced, I think, by the Secession exhibition, that Klimt placed him as the knight on the front line fighting for creative ideals. It's all very fascinating interweaving of these characters, I think.
Can't even imagine what it would be like to walk in as Mahler to see that painting and realize that, oh gosh, that's me. Wow.
Yeah, I think the likeness isn't very good. I think that's the only thing you might say, but it's more that they ascribe that oh, that must be Mahler, I think, I'm sure he felt that was expected. I mean, he had these slightly messianic tendencies. I'm sure he felt that he was being placed in that role and that he had to stand up for these kind of people. I mean, he was taking some level of political risk. He was employed by the Viennese, the Viennese establishment, the imperial government, and there he is standing alongside artists who claimed to have fallen out with the imperial government. So I mean, there was some element of professional risk in doing this, but as I say, I think the imperial government played a clever game, and they were both for and against their artistic freedoms.
There's a wonderful historical irony here, which is that the secession is not the cause of it, but it's certainly typical of the sense at this moment of a need for innovation, for renewal in all the art forms in Europe. And over the course of the next 20 years, I think you've got one of the most revolutionary periods in almost all forms of art. Whether you're thinking of Kandinsky or Mahler or Stravinsky or Debussy, I mean, visual arts, literature, music, so many new isms exploding all across Europe, and all of them full of wonderful developed examples of new aesthetic approaches, culminating in a way in the work of Mahler's most enthusiastic disciple, Arnold Schoenberg, who was, of course, completely typical of this idea of constant renewal and experimentation, working his way through these very big Wagnerian early works into the expressionistic pieces like the Second String Quartet and Erwartung, but then finally ending up in developing the 12-tone system, which was in a way built for the academy, built for the academics. Yes. And through no fault of Schoenberg, I want to point out, it became an instrument of musical ossification that sort of paralyzed musical development for 50, 60 years in the middle 20th century.
Yeah, I suppose we have to remember that academicization was a relatively new thing certainly in 1902 when the Secession exhibition happened. I mean, the power of the universities and the status of academic knowledge had obviously increased greatly during the course of the 19th century, and particularly in music. I mean, the idea that obviously there were learned treatises written by in the Baroque period and so on about music and musical style and so on. But this idea that form had a kind of history and could be codified at all was a relatively new thing. And it had a certain glamour attached to it, even if later on it became quite destructive. So I think we can understand Schoenberg's wish in a way to conquer this academic world as much as he wanted to conquer the more traditional musical world. And of course, he became a very important teacher in later life. I mean, he was very professorial, and the books that he wrote are very professorial, and they're still read by many students today. So it perhaps wasn't there in Beethoven's day. It's hard to imagine him falling out with learned professors, but in some sense, his presence continues to dominate academic institutions today. If you want to go and learn how to compose well, you could do no worse than to go back to Beethoven. I suspect they're less likely to reference Mahler because of his wild idiosyncrasies and his romanticism. But if you want to go on a technical level back to a composer who just knew how to handle notes, you go back to Beethoven. And I think with Schoenberg, very much, again, the values, if not the actual practices, but the values that he was trying to protect with serialism, go back to Beethoven, the tight motive, the organic whole that's expressed in the detail. The formalism is there. I mean, a lot of Schoenberg's serial works are written in forms that are very similar to Brahms and Beethoven. And Schoenberg was very eager to try and find the revolutionary aspect within these composers. There's the famous essay, Brahms the Progressive, isn't there? Where he's trying to show that that the evolution of the way in which form and motive are, the relation between form and motive, between the detail and the whole, is something which goes right back to the way Beethoven composed. I mean, Beethoven was the great constructor of large forms from tiny little cells. The most famous one of all. This is really a model for someone like Schoenberg in his thinking, in terms of how do I construct a work where everything is interrelated in the greatest possible detail. I mean, it's another whole debate as to whether the solution, intellectual solution, is also a solution in terms of the oral reality. But certainly, again, Beethoven is the towering presence, and for Schoenberg also, because Mahler was a saint in his idea. He was the man who sacrificed his life and committed his whole being to the ideals of music as a kind of pure form of thought. It's interesting, though, that there was this tradition within the Viennese artistic community for where modernism, as we might understand it, has almost a kind of puritanical edge. It's a sort of you take things to their ultimate extreme to make your point. And Schoenberg is one of these, as a polemical artist in some ways. And this idea that as an artist you have to adopt a posture and make your point with the greatest possible force, often in slightly provocative ways. That, to me, I always see that with the Schoenbergian, the expressionist works and the serial works. There's this element of shaking your fist back at the musical establishment. In similar ways that I'm sure you catch Mahler on a bad day, he would have railed and ranted against the conservative forces in the same way. And Schoenberg and Mahler were good friends. Mahler supported Schoenberg, and this kind of radical polemical positioning is very much part of their way of working. I'm just wondering whether Beethoven would have done it in the same way. I think he lived in times when artists still had a lot of hope. They had a lot of hope that they were going to change the world, and that the French Revolution would wipe away the old order, and that things would, the universal brotherhood of humanity would all come together, and everything would be transformed. I think that force, that belief, had ailed quite a lot by Mahler's time. They still upheld it as an ideal, but I think they felt the forces were closing in against it, and they were right in that, I think, with the subsequent events.
Well, I mean, if you think of this idea of the secession, the Beethoven exhibition, all of this is a call for renewal of art as a positive force in society. And then really just a little over a decade later, we're into World War I. I mean, it represents a terrible, catastrophic failure of art to protect the world from itself. And you can't blame the artist for that, but you do sense that there are grave limitations to what artists and painters and philosophers can achieve in terms of making the world a better place.